Thank you. Thank you, Tanya, very much for your warm welcome and invitation to here. I'm gonna talk surprisingly things about the future, but the future as how to connect to the future, but how to connect to the future is dependent on the context that we are talking about. So where the world is changing and what type of the connectivity that changing world is taking and requiring from us. But before that, I wanna tell something about myself so you get a little bit of accustomed. So I've been working as a futurist more or less 25 years or so. And back in '97, I did my PhD on climate change, which was then at that time a very early kind of a stage, kind of a phenomenon that we were observing. I was a part of the large-scale science program. This was the first program in Finland, understanding about what's going to happen with the climate, with the Anthropocenic influence on it. So, but then later on, as my kind of a background is in the social sciences, economics partly, some natural sciences as well. I went to the very different parts as I was working with Finland Futures Research Center. So I've been in hundreds of different studies: future of food, future of culture, future of this and that technology, future of different aspects of sustainability and so forth. And so that's, and at some point, I also went to work for a number of years to global insurance company called Allianz. I was the kind of a leading the strategic research, and I've been generally doing quite a lot of stuff with the companies, but not all these companies, also with different governments, not only Finnish governments, but other governments as well. And why I'm actually here is mostly because we have a thing called Club of Rome. And Club of Rome is this kind of an institution or non-institution. It's actually a network of people that are really concerned about the future of our globe. And that started back in the 1960s. How many of you knows the activities of the Club of Rome? Well, there are quite a few, yeah. So we have an annual meeting here, just 20 kilometers from here in the Spirit State. So we start the gathering actually tonight and going to have the next 2 days. Very active sessions, all related about the topics that I'm going to address as well. And then, yes, of course, I'm in this kind of a publish or perish business. So, so this is, I can put this is my last book called Patterns of the Future, which is kind of a recollection, some of my ideas. So, some few words about my institution so that you understand the kind of an institutional background. So, I mean, you guys here in this part of the world, you are very advanced in having all these institutes that you are running that has a connection to the future and is specifically looking at what is happening not now or not in the past, but what's going to happen. And we did that back in Finland. We started already this in '92. And currently, it's an institute that has about 60 people working in the 3 different locations in Finland and really doing a lot of stuff on the different aspects of futures. Particularly, we are a learning institute. So we are running things like degree training, we have a master's training, we have a doctoral training, we do different kind of a professional education activities, in-house or courses, futures guidance project, meaning that we are helping teachers in their work about how to deal with the future and how to put that into their curriculum. And then I'm also working with UNESCO, so I'm a UNESCO chair as well. And with UNESCO, we are particularly taking on the project where we are building a kind of a primary/secondary education program on futures literacy, hopefully being able to spread that around the world with the help of UNESCO network. And so our kind of flagship is really this master program there. So it's a 2-year intensive program, international. So that's been going on now for 6-7 years. And the nice thing about it that we see now the kind of the first generation of a young futurists that start to work in our institute. And unlike me, they are trained. I never trained anything, you know, like I just started to work on that, and that was my training because there was practically no training, at least in our corners of the world. So that's what we're doing, and this UNESCO thing is really important in the sense of getting also connected to people like Tanya and many others who are working on this field of futures of education and learning and complex systems. And I think, Tanya, right, we are now in the verge of getting a real nice bunch of people with the same kind of a ambition to build these future studies, anticipation studies in such a way that to enable actually each of us to do our work in a much more better and influential way. Okay, so let's go to the topic. And since this is a part of the Anthropocene dialogue, I wanted to contemplate a little bit about what is this Anthropocene we are talking about. Everybody knows that it's a kind of we think that it's a follow-up of the Holocene, and that we are now entered the Anthropocene. So what are the type of issues that we have now that we are entering into this era where the first time in the human history, the humans are the ones that have such a global influence that we can really discern out of everything else? The one thing is, of course, to talk about what is actually causing this Anthropocene, which is about the overconsumption of our basic needs. This is not to say that we still have a lot of basic needs to be met on this earth, but it's to say that there are particularly some parts of the world that are hugely over-consuming our natural resources. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that we need to find a new connection, new awareness about the nature, our relationship with the nature. It's been detached, and that's why we are running out into the troubles that we are seeing today. So it's pretty obvious that something needs to be done in our connection to the nature. We need to relate much more how the nature actually operates and works. And I come back to that later. Then we also need to bring back the social. I mean, we've been building these kind of massive infrastructures, and we haven't thought much about the human aspect of them. We have been thinking a lot about the commerce, how it is easy for our cars to operate in the cities. There are so many other aspects besides social aspects that have actually invaded the space. But this is only because we have been living through the industrial era. And it's not only industry that we have been working with, we have been also building the industrial mindset. And part of the industrial mindset that is not very much caring about the social aspect. And that is the very reason why we are in this mess today. And then finally, there needs to be something that connects us to the spirit, which the spirit being the something which actually defines ourselves as human beings. It really talks about the being more holistic way of understanding what do we ask, what do we need, what do we thrive in as a human beings. And we have got lost of that a little bit in the course of this industrial era. So at least all those aspects are a part of this Anthropocene we are entering. Some people say that we have actually entered that right in the birth of the industrialization. Some say it's even beyond that. But however it is, now we start to feel a real impact of that. That's one for sure. So what's the landscape? What's the landscape? The landscape is that, yes, we start to see the consequences of our own action on the global sense. We haven't seen that before. Now we're seeing that. And at the same time, we have this very new build-up, kind of an infrastructure of intelligence that is appearing, giving us a huge amount of opportunities, but at the same time, of course, building different kinds of threats that we have not seen before. We are indeed in the course of changing humanities. Those phases that you see there do not exist today. They are supposed to exist in 2050, where there is a more and more diffusion of the cultures and ethnic backgrounds, and we start to look a little bit new. And then, of course, this comes to the anticipation. What are we anticipating? What are we imagining about the future? That is also changing. That is also historically dependent, and we're going to talk about that as well. Now, one way that I have been approaching this, how to build our stepping stones into the future, is to understand the past in a certain way. And I have found it very useful to use this type of dynamic transition pattern called Kondratiev wave, or key waves. Kondratiev was a Russian economist back in 100 years ago, but he was the first one who started to observe these patterns in our socio-economic structures. And now, as we are moving on, we see that each of these patterns, which last about 40 to 60 years, meaning 2 generations, has its own sort of a driving forces, but it's actually not only about the technology, even if technology has a significant role in each of those phases, but it's actually determining to some extent the next horizon. The ones that we have built this far are building our next horizons. We are building our intentions. And when we have our intentions somewhere, that is kind of the steering wheel that we have to project and actually work towards the future. And it's quite certain that even if we say that there is kind of this technological explosion, because we put much more R&D stakes right now that we've never done back in the history, I still claim that as we proceed, it's not only about the technology, but it's actually how we are taming the technologies and for what purposes that defines those next stages. Anyway, the next stage, what I see it, and I come back to that more closely, is what I call the age of intelligent technologies. And thereafter, I'm talking about the age of living systems technologies, which is a little bit different matter because we're going so much more deeper into understanding how the nature actually operates. And there are lots of disruptive elements there. And we are, of course, all us, I guess, we are kind of entitled to speak about the change and the transformation as the kind of the key vehicle how we understand the future. The future is not a continuum. It's about the change and the transformation and understanding those things. So when we move from the history towards today and off to the future, then we can see that, well, we are using these technologies in a various way, but there is always this human interest, this human need to tame, and to tame those technologies, and it's always a bit of a chaotic process. However, what I think is going to happen next in this sixth wave, in this upcoming wave which we are living right now, is that we are getting into the historically new situation where we are putting a lot of more emphasis to the resource productivity instead of looking at the labor productivity that we have done this far, particularly in our economics. So our economics basically and our industry building has been built on the premise of rising the labor productivity. And it has indeed risen, I think it's around the 20 times from the birth of industrialization. It might be even more of that. But the whole point is that we get a whole new idea about the development when we start to look at the resources and how do we use them instead of just looking at the way that we are using our labor, whether it's a human labor or machine labor. Because then we start to look in a very different kind, this kind of a trinity of human, nature, and technology, which is the ultimate trinity of this sixth wave. So we need to find the balance in a very new way, and for doing that, we need a huge amount of innovation that tackles this problem of the resource productivity. This society, as my one, is very much car-driven society. How crazy that we have so many people possessing cars. How much time over 24 hours, per 24 hours, we are using our cars? 2-3%, maximum 5%, mostly 0, right? That much about the resource productivity of the system. And if we start to look from that perspective of all our systems, we start to observe huge deficiencies there. We have wrong ownerships, we have wrong value cycles, value change, and so forth. So that changes everything, as Naomi Klein said. That really changes everything, that approach. So, and that can only lead us to the intelligence enough solutions that we need. Because all of these intelligent solutions we need happens in this context of a very much of the changing world, as we say. So we have the new elements of globalization. It's very different to the past. I go back to that. Demographic change is occurring in most of the countries. We are going to very heavy demographic transition in which, like my country, which is a typical European country, 20 years from now, it's going to be almost like a 1/3 of population, which is the 65 and older. It's a totally different society in terms of its needs and services. And then we have, of course, these new key innovation platforms. By the way, you will get all these slides if you wish so. I can guarantee that. So we have these new key innovation platforms, and those innovation platforms are actually building that sixth wave type of society and economics and culture. And already see that in the buds, but it's not the dominating scheme as yet. And I come back to that. And then we have, of course, the key trajectories, the kind of a social drivers in the back. The key one being that we have had this kind of a mass scale learning happening in our societies now more than 100 years, and it starts to see in a different way. So how does societies that have such a skilled people gonna operate in the industrial logic? And I mean the representative democracy, which is being built on the premise of the industrial society itself. So we need to seek new forms of influence, of decision-making, of politics as well. So next I'm going to take you shortly through these 7 disruptive elements, after which I go back and look at, okay, what's the context for these disruptive elements to happen, and then going more towards looking at some of the competencies and skills that we need for this type of the era. So the first one is that we have been seeing all around the world in the course of the last 10 years. And we ask ourselves, what's going on? What is happening in these kind of democracies like the United States or UK and also elsewhere? We have a lot of, collusions. We have a lot of events going on that brings a very new type of instability into our political systems. So where does this stem from? Because it needs to have a reason. It needs to have an origin. So one of the origins was actually brought into the public a couple of years ago. His name is Thomas Piketty, French economist, who was observing that how different income classes have fared over the last 100 years. So these 3 different color diagrams represent that. So the first blue one on the top, here are the different income classes, like going like this. Here are the poorest, here are the richest. And then this is going on in time. And this one, I'm checking if I can get, yeah. So it's this one. So this is describing the development of the first 50 years of the 20th century. And you can see that in each of these classes, on average speaking, all the classes were faring quite well. It was quite even, the distribution of the income. Then we have, it was actually this one, this red one. Actually, this first one was from 19 to 1950, with only an exception that actually the other classes, except the really rich ones, were faring much better. And then came the next one from 1950 to 1984, and this blue one is describing that, which you see it's relatively even for all the classes. Now we come to the last. The last don't go so fast. Well, there's some artificial intelligence already in place. So, so this last one, this green one, you see a dramatic difference. You see that when we come to the higher income classes, they start to fare so much better than everybody else. So, globalization, a new type of network society, is actually working very nicely for the rich ones. So, and when we go back and think, who are these guys talking? To whom they are talking? They are talking to those ones, to those depressed ones that have been kind of a feeling very strongly this development that has gone so much for the rich and not for the middle class or for the poor. And this is why I suspect that this is a kind of a tumult situation which is not going to go away unless something really radical starts to happen that start to replace this kind of a scheme which is still going on. The second thing, I think, is this kind of a very new wave of technologies. How many of you remember this? This thing? Yeah, you? Good, at least one. This is the scene. This is a scene from the first kind of a science fiction movie called 2000. How was it? 2000. Space Odyssey. Yeah. And there was this guy on the space, and then suddenly this AI called HAL inside started to notice that that they are going to do something to this machine that the machine doesn't want, because machine started to take too much power in the system. And then this machine itself decided that keep out these guys because it was reading in their lips. And so that was a kind of a token that, all right, it's the age of intelligent machines. But in fact, when you look the last 10 years or 10 to 15 years and look at what type of the publications in the research and science has been kind of out making the others, you see that the applied mathematics, computer sciences, all that, they have had a huge increase in the relative sense in terms of the publications. So that means that there has been a heavy emphasis on those sciences, which now builds the way for the very different type of use of technologies. So, and we can have whatever prospects there. The fact is that, however, that a lot of the routine jobs, rather jobs that can be done by robots, by machines, will be done so when we go into the future. And that is going to take us to a very different kind of a situation. I don't know if the machines will kind of win us, but I'm sure that we will have a much more intensive relationship with the machines, robotics, because of this algorithmic development that we've had, particularly in the last 20 years. And I think all of us need to think in our societies, what does it mean in terms of the competencies? What does it means in terms of the labor markets? In what kind of opportunities we can create in the future when some of the jobs are going to be taken away by these machines. Then, obvious thing, climate change. But one thing about the climate change is really particular. And I wanted to take this on because I'm also the member of the National IPCC committee back in Finland. So I've been, ever since I told you that I did my PhD on 97, and I've been ever since quite heavily involved also some of these negotiations. But what's really different now to what it was even 3-4 years ago, that you see systemic change. Before that time, it was more like anomalies that you could observe in the climatic patterns in different parts of the world. Now it's changing. Now it's happening all the time. So this is the chart that one of these kind of key research institutions, NOAA, so National Atmospheric Organization back in the United States, they are publishing this type of thing, where you can kind of easily see that this is happening everywhere at the same time. So there is no place on Earth that doesn't feel the effects of anthropogenic climate change at this point. And the thing is, of course, when you look at the edge of the science these days and the modeling work that has been done, there we are getting closer to the various tipping points. And those tipping points themselves kind of show that the nature as we know it, it's been threatened in a very different way. And of course, it bounced back to the human societies as well. But the real issue here is really to understand how the carbon works in our global system. Because carbon is a good thing. The problem is that it's now in the wrong place. It was the old Hegel, the philosopher back in the 19th century, who said very fundamentally that dirt is a substance in the wrong place. And now, what we're seeing in the carbon cycle is really that the problem being that it's in the wrong place, but we have places that needs much more carbon than it has today, and that's particularly soil. If you think about what has going on with the industrial agriculture, that's a story where very different type of the cultivation practices have emerged throughout the globe. FAO, the World Food Organization, estimates that 50 to 70% of the humus layer of these cultivated lands have literally vanished. And with that, huge amount of carbon as well. Because carbon, the soil is the second most important deposit for carbon after the atmosphere. Now, there has been going on research that has calculated that only turning 25% of the industrially agricultured land to the practices that would actually tie in the carbon, enrich the humus, enrich the top layer, enrich the amount of the microbes that are in the topsoil. If we could turn only 20%, 25% of that agricultural land into that type of the regenerative farming, we could tie in as much as 250 gigatons of carbon. Now, to get perspective on that, we annually release somewhere between 50 to 70 gigatons on global basis. So if we were able to tie these 250 gigatons, we could drop the atmospheric level of carbon back to 350 ppm. You know that it's been going from 350, which is the kind of a pre-industrial level now, which is at 415 or so. So, and I'm telling you this because the real problem is not that we don't have the solutions, but we are not looking for those. We don't have the eye for solutions. And because everything that goes around with this great international climate politics, hardly accept that this is the case, even though there is all science backing this thing. So the problem being that we are much too narrow, much too sort of a discipline in the wrong way when we are looking for solutions. Because solutions has to come from the systems thinking. Okay, so let's look at the next thing. And all these are, by the way, of course, heavily connected. Now we look at the economy, how the economy really works, and what can we do about it. Sorry about this. This is a complex system. You can hardly read it, neither do I. But the whole thing is that something has been going on in our economy. So what has been happening is that here the end result is what is called the winner-takes-it-all markets. There is a huge amount of consolidation that has happened in the course of the last 20 years, but at the same time, the markets themselves has become much more efficient. So on the basis of that, we can say that we have these companies, these FAANG companies. We have Google's, Alphabets and Amazon's and Netflix's and Alibaba's that are part of this engine. And they are part of this engine not only because they are using data as their material, but because actually they are diving into the human understanding or understanding the human behavior. That's their business, to understand individual and collective behavior of the human being and act upon that knowledge. And they have doing that very consistently. And as a result of that, they don't seem to be stopping at anywhere. So they are growing, and they are eating up their rivals on the way. So that is something which we are observing, and I'm sure that in the next phase we start to look at what can we do about it, because it is a very worrisome development that we are observing, even though most of us are using those services of these companies. Okay, the fifth element of this transformation is about the transformation of the cities. So this transformation of the cities is actually happening in the forefront of this very heavy urbanization that is taking place. So we all know that this decade is the first decade where a majority of the people are living in urban environments, while at the same time we have a very different challenges, how we actually reconstruct those urban realities in the face of sustainable development, in the face of digitalization, in the face of globalization. So what's actually going on is that I look around at your space around here, very nice, thriving space when you look outside, which you cannot do right now, but I had a glimpse of that. So what is happening to our urban spaces? We want to humanize them. They are very inhuman in a very sense of the word. Just because there have been the market forces in the last 70 to 80 years that have been driving the city development. But we want to have something totally different. This is actually a picture from one of the projects that we have been running with Anna in our own university city of Turku, where we make a groundbreaking vision and did some further work around how to kind of reorganize and rethink the center of the city. And we still to see whether they're going to turn it according to our vision, but at least there is a heavy political support for that, but the practice might be much more difficult. Anyway, that's a part of the transition, that we are actually getting those places that inhabit most of the people that we have on this earth, that we are changing them into something which are much more human-like entities than before. Then the number 6 is about the changing work. So how does actually our work and our labor markets are changing? So one of the things that we can easily observe there is that the distributed power is increasing. It's increasing in the labor markets, but it's also increasing in infrastructures and systems. And that is because we are living in an age where we have abundance of information. Now, abundance of information is the key, because when we had the scarcity of information, these hierarchical systems, top-down driven systems, were much more efficient. Not so when we are living in the age of abundant data and information. So what we're going to see is that the labor markets are changing in ways where it's not anymore that stable. It's anymore based on the very defined skills, competencies, certificates, that this kind of an industrial way of building our economies and labor markets have been dictating this far. It's much more swift, much more, I would say, uncertain, and requires a different kind of skills than in the past. And so it looks as if there is a kind of a new paradigm of management, which is building onto the fore and are expecting very different things and drivers inside the organization, inside the companies. But as with any, this type of a shift, this is not happening easily, but you can easily see that there are these traits, these features, these signals that are at work right now. Finally, I would like to say some word about the geopolitical change. So what's really been going on is that there are two connected phenomena. The one phenomena is that we have been going on towards convergence of the national economies for a long time. So for instance, 30 years ago, Finnish export infrastructure versus Chinese export infrastructure was so much different. Today, they are much more similar looking things. And this you can observe everywhere. So there is a certain convergence, while at the same time, this old industrial machine is slowing down as well. And this is what you see in the interest rates. This is what you see everywhere happening in our economies these days. And it's slowing us along as we are not reinventing our economies. At the same time, there is this very interesting shift that is taking place, which after the 250 years will take the power away from the OECD countries. Very historically, a significant change where these power relations, because of course it's not only economic, it's a political, it's military power, it's even cultural power that is shifting. And probably you are feeling that also here in South Africa, as we are feeling that in Finland. Much more Asians flooding in the markets in a different way and taking the positions that they hadn't had before. Well, that's about the change. So how to contextualize this? My predecessor in the center was a very intelligent and wonderful person called Pentti Malaska. He founded our center back in 1992. And one of the things that he operated with was this type of model of social transformation dynamics. Trying to understand how this kind of a dynamics that is built into our system is kind of suggesting the new next steps. And you see there, according to this model, that we started with agrarian dominance. With first extensive and then intensive growth, we go into the industrial dominance. And in the industrial dominance, we start to see the germs of a very new kind of era. And he called that service dominance. And if you look at historically the development, in most of the economies, indeed, the services have become all the time the bigger part of the economy, of the turnover of any single economy. But it's not only that. It's actually a much more comprehensive kind of a development when we might be in the future be consuming much more the type of the services that we have not thought as service. Like consuming human relationships. Because here at the bottom, we are moving from society of basic needs into society of tangible needs, and here is the society of intangible needs. And intangibles are, of course, those things that has to do a lot with the human relations, with human interest of different kinds. And we're probably somewhere here, right now, here, that going into the service dominance. But if we want to reach a little bit further on and think what's happening after we have healed our social relationship, our social contract, so to say, which is the next thing at our hand. I would say even it's much more urgent thing than to do something about the climate change. We cannot think of building a stable and sustainable societies unless we have our social contract into the stage which is kind of acceptable for all of us. But when we have done that, then we probably get into the next stage, which I suggest has to do with the nature's dominance. Instead of the service dominance, we go into the nature dominance, which means that we derive a lot of our inspiration for our society from nature, directly from nature. But it's not the same thing as what we started off here. But there is also a kind of a feedback loops which describe this. Another way to say this is that if you think what has really gone wrong in our industrial age is not perhaps that we are not accepting that there is a freedom that is needed in the cultural sphere of our society. We more or less accept everybody at this stage, at this time of the history, and I know, of course, your tumultuous history on this, that we need freedom. We need self-expression because that creates the right type of spiritual order. We need also, in the political and social sector, we need a high sense of equality because only that can bring rights and justice. That is also universally accepted, even if it doesn't appear so in the practice of the many countries. But what we have totally wrong in our industrial order is economic sector. Why? Because if you go into any business school, and my business school is one of them, and you start to talk about the economics, you're not talking about the solidarity. You might talk a little bit about partnerships, but you certainly talk about the competence. Competition, more competition, more competition, even more competition. And in fact, economic sector should operate on the principle of solidarity, of partnership. And unless we get into that point, our economy until that point will operate as it is now, which is elephant in a living room. Because only then we can have the order in our economics, which is based on the true wealth and prosperity of our people. So, and think about that. My predecessor, Malaska, drew this thing already in 1989. He was foreseeing all this, what we are now facing right now in our current reality. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk to you is about what about skills? What do we need to be built on? What type of the capacities we need to have in our times to be able to meet these challenges? The fact is that our current way of making decisions are all too much based on the past. That ties us in the past and does not deliver us ideas that are needed in order to create something which is truly innovative. So, at most, our current societies are able to build the innovations that are not in any sense radical, but are perhaps taking a little bit step forward. This is because we are always kind of inclined to be working on the known parameters. And I'm going to explain what that means. All our institutions seem to be rather conventional. Again, they are built on the institutional practices that was invented for the industrial age. My university, our university, is one good example of that. Very old-fashioned in many ways, and we are struggling with those. We're struggling in those institutions that are much too old, much too conventional, because they are so much tied to the past. Now, when our anticipatory systems are built on the past, our past experiences, particularly our industrial era, the way that we start to operate in this changing environment is to increase their coercion. We don't try to loosen them, we are increasing the coercion. We try to maintain the old system even if it doesn't work very well. So, in the fundamental sense of the word, there is no future in the past. There is never any future if we are too much connected to the past. And the past, I mean now our industrial past, not our real past, but our real industrial past. When we go into the future, in the real sense of the word, and building out our anticipatory systems based on that, we go there without coercion. We let that happen. That's how the institutions need to work. I did a study several years ago about the best organizations and companies around the world, the best practices. And I saw that in none of them there was coercion. They let them build in a self-organized manner. They work, they target their objectives, their behaviors. That is when you start to be connected to the future, when you leave the coercion out of the equation. So, and this is all based on what we know about our basic needs. This is the Maslow way of looking at the basic needs, and it's still very valid. And we still need to fulfill our basic need. There is no way around that. But as said, if we start to over-consume those basic needs, we get into trouble because we need to find an alternative. If we don't find the alternative, survival turns into addiction. Look at the rise of the addiction in our modern societies. There is huge expanse of various kinds of addictions. And it's because people get overrun by the overusage of their basic needs. Adaptation turns defensive. We get more control. We get more power games. Connection, our connection needs start to look like we are putting the blame, a lot of blaming into the others. And the actualization to become oneself, whether it's about the individual, collective, or nation, we get stuck to our own pride. We became so much of our own pride that we don't see the others anymore. Sounds familiar, right? So the way to get out of there is to find something new. Is to find something which we can build our future. And my way to look at the thing is that we need these new active and dynamic skills. And these dynamic and active skills are kinds that gives us the meaning in this world, gives the purpose of going beyond our own confines. So that's how we I have sort of constructed this as a kind of a disciplinary approach, what we call the futures literacy, where we have actually these three cognitive capacities. So we have a kind of a understanding what's going around us, sort of kind of a trends, ideas, systems thinking, all that aspect. We have the motivational capacity approach. So the emotional and motivational capacities that builds the conscious relationship between ourselves and the world, particularly needed with the younger generation. They need to understand what are they striving in the world, what they want to contribute into the world. And then this scheme of active skills. Now these active skills have these kind of four aspects. First of all, planetary skills. Planetary living skills really means that we understand the physics of our environment. And in our detached world, where we are going more into the digital, we more urbanize, we get lost of that connection. And if we don't have that connection on the very personal basis, but also on the collective basis, I don't think that we can understand why we need to reintegrate ourselves and our understanding in what's happening in the realm of nature. Because the nature and the global nature in this case is our ultimate reference point. So we need to understand how we individually live in a way that is intact with the planetary conditions. Complexity skills are those type of the skills that are particularly needed in our complex environment. So meaning that how can we define and find the information that is relevant out of this kind of an ocean of information that is expanding around us? What are our ways and measures actually to find the meaningful information that keeps our own thinking consistent, which is becoming harder as we speak? And creativity skills, I mean those skills that we are able to change our hats. Like I gave this example about the climate change and how to tackle the climate change, to find solutions, new solutions to old or new problems. Also very unconventional solutions. Again, this is about the connected to the future rather than to the past. And then lastly, empathy. So how do we learn, how do we teach to be in the shoes of the others? This is becoming a pertinent issue in our more globalized and networked world. So how do we learn, how do we teach that? That, I think, to my mind, builds upon this futures literacy that we need to deal with. Okay. If there is anything about the future itself that we can say is that it's not what it's supposed to be. So it's uncertain. It always comes on the margins. I mean, if you look at the history of the innovation, it always happens in that way. It comes a little bit unconventional spot. And so those that think that they know exactly how the business and the future is running, particularly if they think that they are on the top right now, they're probably going to be disappointed what's going to happen in the future. So there is this kind of a surprising element. We have actually one group of people that have been working on this kind of a theory of surprise. And we had just a meeting last week in Vienna. So it's but I don't know if we can ever reach that theory of surprise, because even that would be surprise how it actually starts to work. So I don't know. It's a crazy idea, but you need to try something. Okay. And yeah, more of this thing you will find in my books and articles. And I think thank you very much for your attention. And now time for questions.
And I've been working in climate change and complexity. And I'm specifically referring to the section you spoke about the soil needing more carbon than it has, and that being the store of a lot of anthropogenic reproduced carbon dioxide, and then the next wave being that of embracing nature, perhaps. Just tying these two ideas. And my question to you was, you did say that the science is there, but there is almost a political blindness to it. There is a desire, especially from, say, the OECD countries, because of the large investments in technology, to pursue a technological solution for climate change, which is to drill it underground. And when I reviewed the IPCC 1.5 as a previous author of the IP6, AR5, I also noticed that there wasn't justice or equity concerns within the drilling, because we don't know what the outcomes will be. My question quickly is, where do you think change lies? How can change be achieved in the thinking of those who are still pushing for technological versus natural solutions?
Very good question, and we need to trace back a little bit. Because what lies behind the agriculture? Agribusiness, right? Agribusiness, which is tied a lot to the food production, so food business. And these two actually constitutes probably the most powerful business in the world. All of their interest is that they continue the way that they have been doing this far, because their life and their success and their monies are dependent on that, more or less. That's one thing. Then there is another thing, which comes from this scientific work. Now, the problem why it's not, or part of the problem why it's not being included into Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change reports and works as much as it could, is because they are saying that there is no good way to measure how this carbon should be will be tied, and how to measure that, how to build that into the calculation system, where we are kind of building the idea of the carbon budget. So, and that's more like a problem for science and research, and that's I said that's already been tackled. Actually, very recently there came a new special report on IPCC that is tackling some of these issues. But why it has been in the marginal this far, because this is what I told you, it's not a rocket science, it's actually been known for a good amount of time, is because there has been those private interests there that has pushed this as a way. It's much more convenient even to talk about the transition on the energy systems, which has been most of the discussion that has been going on, or energy/mobility systems. But this has been kept out for these commercial reasons, and partly for scientific reasons. European Commission has promised that they will keep this now in the agenda for the next 10 years. So probably they will now come up with the real calculation methodologies that enables this approach. Of course, the issue is that what we mean by regenerative agriculture is pretty much as organic agriculture, yes? And again, that's also another political front line there, which is kind of a going against of the current kind of advocates of current agricultural systems. So we see always these things, and then there has to be just this enormous political weight and scientific evidence. And only through that we can get closer to the real solutions that we're talking about.
You turn again in a sec.
It's just a quick flow from that. So if the question
Very
is,
quick.
if the question is around the political and the scientific, then how can it be disruptive and surprise as well? Because disruptions don't necessarily come from what the science tells us.
Well, I think that the science, about the surprises, I think that will happen is that we're going to see much more surprising events to come when it comes to the Earth system and how it actually signifies itself in a way that the type of the disruptions that we are already seeing in our weather patterns, but it's going to be magnified. That means then that the new solutions are much more acutely to be found than was before the case. And then I think it's a case for this type of a new, and I would say in this current scheme, unconventional and even surprising solutions that comes from there. Because the stuff that I'm talking to you, it's not known. It's not known. It's still on the margin. I have seen that time and again. So in that sense, it is a surprising, although if you go deeper into that, you can see that, well, actually, it's just a common sense.
I had questions there, and in front here, and then indicate as well, please. And so, and Markku, and just to riff quickly off there, as South Africans, most of us in the room, we know the value of having a good crisis. Yeah?
Yes.
But it doesn't always help.
We've had a couple of crises, one or two which we haven't wasted, which has been a good thing. Please.
I'm part of Center for Social Transformation. My name is Drinka, and I'm looking at geopolitics, specifically in Southern Africa. And what we were talking here, and the assumptions that we put in the science, that we believe in justice, democracy, it's not what I see happening.
Yeah.
So it seems like while we talking about skills for future literacy and what should happen, this is not what is happening in reality, because we see more and more people living in alternative reality, completely disattached from reality, and how lots of forces are targeting to kill the ability to manage large amount of information and to create people who believe in only certain type of information, and that we fail to have a systemic thinking. So what makes you believe that this is the future and not utopia, and what are the steps that you see happening for these ideas to be implemented?
Well, it was just noted that you have some experience about the crises and transformations here. So this time of history, of course, this is utopia, right? But utopias are essentially a kind of a system of energy that we need. Because if we don't have the utopias, what do we have? We have dystopias, or we just let the future be as it is, so to say. The whole question about this, what we call the anticipation studies, is that how do you use future? Do you use it intelligently as to aspire something which you currently see, but you think that there needs to be that objective? Or you just let everything go, and then you just using actually other people's futures, and you don't mind yourself so much what's actually going to happen. And in this type of the indifference, I think it's rising, but it's rising because of this loss of the meaning. Because the loss of the meaning comes when you don't have a personal connection to the future, as well as to the institutional. So of course it's a utopia. Of course it's not happening today, but to construct the future in the way that is based on the idea which is not only of your kind of a fairy ideas, but it's based on kind of a systems thinking, as I try to describe, then you can start to look the ways that you can kind of build of that type of preferable future that you want to build. If you don't have an idea of the future that you want to have, or if that idea is very faint and it's not systematic, then it's a very weak idea. So we need to build on ideas that have some systems thinking behind and understand the complexity. And even if so, that the reality is very far from where we want to see it, we still need to imagine that future. That's our responsibility.
And I feel compelled to add that here at Centre for Complex Systems and Transition, we've been doing amazing work for some years now on identifying pockets of the future in the present that we call little seeds of a good Anthropocene, and actively working with those and building a database of, and then seeing what could come out that is good, that exists already, even though it's niche and marginal in the present. And it's that working with the future, using the future, that becomes really the key sort of thing that we want to look at.
Can I just add one more thing? Because this is a very important point that you raised. I've been working a lot with schools in this kind of a UNESCO thing, but actually before that. And one of the things that I tend to do at the beginning when we start to talk about, I let them to build a cloud. So I ask them to give a one word, the one primary word that comes to their mind when they think about the future. And then we build this collective understanding there. So they see what they think, and that's what the others are thinking about, how they primarily think about the future. And you see always in the beginning that there are lots of more kind of fears than there are kind of hopes and promises there. And so, and then if you start working on those things, then you can start to think that, there is a way actually that to kind of face the future means also that you start to build immediately some hope in there. And in fact, we have been measuring some of the courses that we have built into the schools, and we see how much more confident the pupils become about the future once they have been able to deal with that. So it's kind of a facing the thing, and then that builds in itself a bit more trust towards the future.
Hi, I'm Zon, and I'm from Teach to Future South Africa. So we work with Peter Bishop on this program. So I relate completely to what you've just said, because we've seen that as well. But my question actually, you made an interesting comment, because lots is considered about climate change, but you said we should build our social contract before we even worry about climate change. And I was just interested to know, in your view, where would the entry point for healing that social contract come from? Because of all the fragmentation and all the... it's such a big challenge.
Yeah.
What are the levers that could move that social contract into the right direction?
Yeah. Well, this is a line of the thinking that I have been developing quite recently, actually, because I've been working on this climate change so long, and I have been doing hundreds and hundreds of, courses, presentations, stuff, and really working with myself also with NGOs and stuff. So I still believe we need to work on climate change. But it has kind of occurred to me that a lot of this kind of a debate about our relationship with the climate and nature conservatism and all that leaves aside this kind of a social aspect of thing. And if we do that, then we are kind of missing a kind of a huge potential which is there. So, of course, you can think that, well, it's actually a way to unite people that they start to work on things that have positive impact on nature. That can be thought as well. But if there is some sort of a real fundamental flaws in our social systems, I see, and now I take kind of a more macro perspective, I really think that we need to first to build our kind of a social cohesion before we can see that this could be a worldwide thing, that we make this kind of a nature contract. The first social contract, then nature contract. And that's the way we do this kind of a healing process on this earth. And since I very much dislike this type of dystopias where we are actually, okay, let's take first of all 3/4 of the population out of this globe. Probably with Elon's help, we are projecting them out in the Mars or somewhere, or half of it, I don't know. But that we take the granted that, well, that it's really a matter of distribution here on Earth. It's so much matter of distribution. Because you can also see that, from a demographic point of view, when you get to the level where your society is nicely fulfilling the basic needs, your demographics start to look very different as well. So I think it's kind of it's to recognize that the social, in spite of this huge problem with climate, the social needs to be there at first, and we need to. At least we need to have that in mind while we're doing our environmental work. Let's put this.
Yes, please.
I'm Rainer Klinghaus from the Berlin Institute for Population and Development, and I'm a fellow at STEER at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think you described the actual situation, the state of the planet and the state of humankind quite well, very well. But I'm a bit skeptical about your solutions, because what you said about creativity, to understand complexity, and that we need more empathy, that's not really new. Because we know we need that for a long time, since the Bible was invented or whatever. If you look at our capability, at our ways to anticipate problems, we're not really good at that. I mean, at least since the time of the Club of Rome in the 60s and 70s, we had hundreds and thousands of studies until the IPCC reports that tell us what's happening. And in fact, we know solutions. You presented some, but we're not reacting. So the knowledge is growing exponentially, and the capability to act is not growing exponentially. It's getting wider and wider. So there's probably it's probably a dead-end road if we try to reform humankind in that way. But if we look at reality, and you had that in one graph, you didn't show it that way, but you said there is a convergence of growth, because the emerging nations have less and less growth. But the most interesting thing, you went back until 2000 in your graph. But if you go back 50, 60 years, you see that the GDP growth rates in the developed countries has been going down. So we had a 10-year average in Europe, 10%, 8%, 6%.
Yes.
And now we're down below 1. All industrialized nations are around that. The emerging countries are going down even much faster.
Yeah.
And so there must be a structural reason for the reduction of growth. And I think we should more focus on that structural, which are normally treated as structural problems, but it could be structural benefits. Because following the theory of secular stagnation, there are 3 structural reasons for the decline of GDP growth in large part of the world. So first is population growth is fading out. Second is productivity gains are getting smaller. Third is inequalities in society, because we have so rich people, so many rich, or some rich people that have so much money that cannot spend it and do not contribute to growth, and on the other hand we have too many poor people that cannot contribute to growth as well. And then we have environmental factors that reduce the possibility to grow. So why don't we take this opportunity that less growth is forced by structural changes and try to adapt? Because what we do so far is to increase growth by pumping money into the market, by reducing interest rates, etc., etc. And that doesn't work. And politicians don't understand that, because if you flood the market with money, you can have an impact on cyclical growth phases, but not on structural growth decline. And so we should try to understand what is happening. It sounds like a Gaia theory, but it isn't. But there is less growth. So it's...
Well, thank you. I think from my perspective, what I'm thinking is that there was this one of the most renowned economists in the world, Joseph Schumpeter, that was talking about the creative destruction, by which he meant that the innovation happens when there is sufficient amount of creative destruction at place, which means in our economies that then there needs to be a sort of crisis there. Now, the problem with the less of growth is that we would need more of that. The problem is really that we need to reinvent our economies. We reinvent, I mean, how crazy is our economy currently? You know that the most of the revenues that we get for our public sector operation comes from taxing the labor, right? And the much lesser part comes from taxing anything else, like using the raw materials, like using those precious resources. So we are not using the steering instrument in our societies as we should. So we're making the labor very dear in our economies, while we're still helping to squander our natural resources in an enormous manner. We need to put this into the upside down, and only then we can really innovate and rebuild our economies as they should. I mean, the GDP measurement itself is a very old-fashioned. Of course, we need to have much better devices and indexes, how we are measuring the progress in our economies. And that's very bad ones. A lot of the stuff that lets, as you were indicating, that lets the growth in our economies comes at the cost of the environment and at the social cost as well. But we don't measure them. We don't calculate it in our current system. So the system needs to be changed. And more we go into this stagnation, towards more stagnation of the economies, the more it helps us to reinvent it. Because only the crisis seems to help, nothing less.
I've got Jan and then Nina, and then I'm going to ask for a last call, please.
There's so many different things that struck a chord for me in what you were talking about. And I very much love the idea of, we all know we need to look at patterns from the past to be able to put together scenarios and to try to forecast, but the solutions come from radical thinking and decoupling yourself from the past and getting rid of the subjectivities and old solutions that doesn't work. But I want to come to the social compact part of it, which I think, I love the question about what the entry point would be for that. How can we commence the social compact? And I think South Africa actually has quite a lot to offer in that regard. Mm-hmm. Our country's got a rich history of managing to bring people together from different backgrounds, from different demographics, and to come to solutions. We just won the Rugby World Cup again, and we also have we had a very tough past 10 years or a very tough decade behind us, and you even started to get a feeling amongst friends that you had never thought would consider that to leave the country. Yeah. But the 10 years of negativity and negative social media and radical groups taking over our realities of what is actually going on in the country is being combated by ordinary people. Well, it was an estate agent who started the group, but there's a group I'm staying in South Africa that's now got about more than 800,000 people on there. And people post positive news about the country, which is also most probably not the whole reality, but at least it puts something on your phone every day where you see a different reality, you see the good stuff that is happening in the country. And I think worldwide, we are so influenced by the media and the need to add income by by the bad news sells, that similar type of movements will not come from governments. It needs to come from ordinary people that start to take over the space on people's phones with positive stories, and that there are actually solutions. Very few people know that there are lots of people working on trying to solve problems with the environment, and bringing AI into the picture to help to solve the problems that we have faced with the environment. So the initiative needs to come from ordinary people, and I think South Africa actually can play a role in helping to facilitate to get stuff going. You know, so it's a
Nina's indicating that her comments are linked. Nina, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. It seems the South Africans are obsessed with the social contract. And I continue that idea from my colleague. And while I agree with quite a few of the things that he said, I would disagree that South Africa is good at distribution or redistribution, which is part of where we find ourselves in a failed contract, and how people experience that as a betrayal. So from that experience and from understanding the ways in which we could begin to heal it, what is the role of a state, of the state in a decentralizing trend of the future, where power and organization perhaps don't hold the same weight. And we're also seeing very radically, I think, a depoliticization of our young people, where the belief, where they don't see themselves reflected in these kinds of political systems. What is, again, I suppose, the role of the state as a lever to facilitate the healing of the social contract, and to what extent can we grab hold of our agency to try and do it, knowing that redistribution may not necessarily be within our agency to facilitate on a structural level.
Yeah, just let me put one. You see nothing here. It was supposed to be a chart of the world, so even so, it's not so good. So I think you're sort of pointing that to the one important thing that that is somehow in my mind, but it's a bit hard to explain, which is that if you look at the connectedness, if you could draw a map of the connectedness of the connectedness of today versus connectedness, say 50 years ago of the globe, you could see that there is an enormous amount of new connectedness there, however you measure that. You measure that in the communication, data, whatever, you have it there. So the point is then that where does the learning come from in this global society, where it used to come from a specific spots, those countries to happen to have a upper hand. In this time and towards future, these key learnings and these best practices, I would say, would come from much diverse set of countries than in the past. So, and that is only because we are so much more connected. And you know, you can describe the whole human history in terms of how much communication there has been. And there have been phases in the history where there is more kind of a increase of the quantity of the communication, then there is an increase of the quality of communication. Now, the last 40 years of the digital revolution, that was definitely expansion of the quantitative communication. I believe that this next phase would be much more defined by qualitative communication systems increasing. And that means, if that is correct, that then this kind of these ideas, how we can heal society, not those particular societies, but how we can kind of transfer this learning to the others. The amount of those countries and the amount of the possibilities and the surprises involved, which gonna be much higher, I believe. So even if you say that part of that was successful, part of that was a failure, then we can say, okay, there is a learning that we can take from there. This failed because of this reason, this was successful because of that reason. I think it's very unique, your experience here, because indeed, you have been so multicultural as a society. You know, look at my own country. It's totally the opposite. It's so homogenic. We have a couple of Russians and a couple of Swedes, and that's it. And Anna, who's been bold enough to move to Finland, you know, which is not easy.
That is, Markku, this is a microcosm because of our extreme inequality as well.
Yeah.
So,
I'm not saying we're good at solving inequality, but we're a good microcosm. So
which is great for experiments.
Yeah, and talking about experiments, and I want to point out to your comments about growth. Markku showed actually an interesting graph by Piketty, Alaska, the futurists who started our center. There is something very interesting about that graph, because he, as Markku said, back in the early 90s, he was already looking at this sort of social slash environmental trends, and so he said we're moving from an tangible, so industrial era towards the service era, intangibles. We are, and Markku mentioned that we're sort of like in the middle of that, but there is growth, and there is exponential growth, but that means the Amazons, the Googles, Amazon's being, I think, worth $1 trillion now, I believe, these companies, that's what it's worth. So we have exponential growth, but that's not the growth that speaks to all of us, and it's not the growth that's going to sort of heal our social and planetary problems. So we go back to the social, and we go back to actually the interventions and the sort of skills that we all have to put together, and the future that we sort of have to dream for, to really make a dent there. Otherwise, we are hopeless. We're just gonna be together, just following them. So those interventions have to come from inside the system. So from us, as Markku says already, from nature. What can nature do to help this transition?